This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Now, this week we are going to do a podcast on Medea. I've been asked to do Medea. I'm kind of surprised I haven't done Medea already. When I went back and looked through my list, I said, no, I haven't done her, which is very odd because to me she should have been done probably in conjunction with Circe or Circe, as some people like to say, because of the relationship between them. But I felt that, but when I saw that there was an omission there and somebody had requested that I do Medea, I thought, okay, let me make sure that I include this in this year's list. Now, the funny part is I had already recorded a podcast on Medea before I left for England, because I'm in England now. And, and when I went back to review the audio, somehow it's like the first 15 minutes of it is my Pombagira podcast, and then the rest of it is the stuff I'd recorded for Medea, but it was very choppy. So I have no idea what got into my recorder, but it was... I had that same problem with Scylla and Charybdis, although that one I was able to salvage most of it. This one I couldn't. So we're re-recording live the day that I'm actually issuing it to my patrons. So this is an up-to-the-minute. This is unusual. I usually record podcasts in advance just because I want something ready and prepared when the 2-week mark comes. So anyway, so with that little explanation and introduction, I'm also mentioning it because I have normally when I do these, I would actually have my pile of books. I would have Euripides play. I would have all the stuff that I would do. But because I'm overseas and not, don't have access to most of my book collection, I'm going to have to do this. We're just going to have to do the short versions of things. I'm not going to be able to quote from anything. But nonetheless, I don't think that will take away from the final result. So with all that said, let's talk about Medea. So who is Medea? Well, Medea is a witch figure. The first place that we really see her is in the Argonautica, which is one of the, even though the version of the Argonautica that we have is from Apollonius Rhodius, which is quite late. It's, very, very... probably more, it's Roman, actually. It's more in the Roman Empire period, which is far later than, say, what we get from Homer or what we get from Hesiod. But the actual story is mentioned by historians like Herodotus, and it's very clear that this is a much older story. The characters in the Argonautica are all characters, they're all the predecessors of the great heroes that we see in the Trojan War. They're either their fathers or they're connected. The way the Argonautica is written, at least the version that's written down, is very bizarre because you have the fathers, say, of all of the great warriors that we see in the Iliad, but you also have people like Orpheus, you have people like Heracles. It's just a weird mishmash of heroic figures on this journey that seems actually very magical. The actual trajectory of the Argo, which is the ship where Jason is going to receive the golden fleece from Aeetes so that he can claim his kingship from King Peleus. Okay, and when he goes out on his quest, it's a very, very weird quest because we don't see Jason behaving the way that other heroes behave. And the person who is really doing all of the work here is Medea. Okay? So let's talk about all of her background here, and then I'm going to go over each of the stories connected with her, and then what we can somewhat infer from this. So, okay, there's not really sure what the etymology of the name is. I've seen this one that says Medea may imply a planner or a schemer, but not really sure about that. So she's the daughter of King Aeetes. She's a niece of Circe or Circe. I only say Circe, but it's Circe is also correct. And she's the granddaughter of Helios, the sun god. Okay. And she's also mentioned in Hesiod's Theogony, I'm seeing here, but But Medea, she's mentioned that, which is a tragedy written by Euripides, again, in a period of time that would have been before the Argonautica was actually written down. And then Apollonius Rhodius's Argonautica, which is a bit later. And she also appears in the stories related to King Aegeus and Theseus, the same hero who defeats the Minotaur in yet another myth and legend. So we see Medea appear in a number of places, and she is, depending on what versions you're reading, what play you're reading, her behavior and her the impression you have of her can be either more positive or more negative. Like, you'll either have more sympathy for her or you won't. And in this way, I feel like in a lot of ways she's the perfect quintessential dark feminine figure, because she embodies all of the qualities of the dark feminine, and behaves in a certain way, but a way that we can look at both morally and non-morally. Although frequently we do tend to look at it in a more moral stance, I don't know that one necessarily has to do that. So what I'm gonna do first is I want to talk first about her role in the Argonautica and the events and what happened, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit about her relationship to Jason and what that means for the Argo and that actual scene. I'm going to talk a little bit about her marriage to King Aegeus, the king of Athens, and her role there. She is, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about her other mentions, her mention by Herodotus, and the influences that she has and her connection to Hecate, who is, she's supposed to be a priestess of Hecate, at least that's what's implied in the Argonautica itself. So let's, so there's quite a bit of material here to cover, and there's a lot of inference. So what happens? Let's start with the Golden Fleece story, the Argonautica. Okay, so Jason, he goes on this voyage. He makes a number of stops on the way, which is very similar in feel to things like the Odyssey, for example, although this predates the Odyssey. Although, and I'm not really sure whether this is Apollonius Rhodius's edition or not, Jason ends up going across, because he's basically going across what was called the Euxine Sea, or like the Black Sea area, towards Colchis. And then it's like somehow magically he's back in the Mediterranean again, following the same track as Odysseus did in his journey. So that's very weird. And he's on a magical ship, by the way. The Argo is made from the oak of Dodona, and Dodona is one of the earliest oracles. We hear about the oracle of Apollo at Delphi a lot, for example, in Greek, mythical writings and other places. They talk about the oracle of Apollo, but the oracle of Dodona was much older, and the Dodona oak that the ship was made from was said to be able to talk and to prophesize. And by the way, half the people on Jason's ship were prophets of some kind. They had the ability, they had oracular abilities, and he also had Orpheus on his ship. He had a really strange and mystical cast of characters in addition to the ancestors of the heroes. So he goes to the island. Okay, he finally gets to Colchis. He lets the king Aeetes know what he wants. And Aeetes says if he wants to retrieve the Golden Fleece, he's got several, obstacles to overcome. And most importantly, there is he's got certain, there's a dragon that guards the fleece, for one thing. And there's also he had several tasks. First one is he had to plow a field with fire-breathing oxen that had to be yoked by Jason himself. Okay, then he had to sow the teeth of a dragon, but again, very similar to a story connected with the founding of Thebes by Cadmus. There was a story where he had sowed the teeth of a dragon, and these warriors sprouted up that were called the Spartoi. And the same thing happens in this story. You have these warriors that appear and, ready for combat that spring from these dragon's teeth. And then, of course, the last task, he had to fight and kill the sleepless dragon that guarded the fleece. Okay. So lots of symbolism here too, in this kind of in this kind of thing. First you had, like I said, these fire-breathing oxen, which which has this implication of, when we think about fire, we not think about destruction, but we think about passion. We think about the passions. We think about anger. We think about things like that, right? And then, of course, with the fighting men, I mean, you have this idea of, overcoming these kinds of conflicts or these attacks or these oppositions that may come from these unexpected places. And then, of course, the dragon itself tends to be very chthonic in its symbolism, because the dragon, frequently we see the chthonic represented by a serpent or a dragon. This kind of, when we think of Typhus in Greek mythology, the great dragons that are associated particularly with sacred places, sacred springs, and in this case with this particular golden fleece. Now, in each one of his tasks, he is helped by Medea. Now, when he lands on the shore, Medea sees him, and Aphrodite decides that she's going to step in and interfere here, and she has Eros shoot his arrow at Medea, and she immediately falls in love with Jason. So she is determined to help him through this process. Okay. So when his first task, when he has to encounter, yoke the fire-breathing oxen, Medea gives him a kind of an ointment, and an unguent to anoint himself and his weapons so that he's not burned. Okay? Because, as we said, she's a priestess of Hecate. She's very skilled. You almost feel like an element of Morgan. I mean, the stories are not connected, okay? But just when I think about what I've said about Morgan Le Fay, you see a lot of these same qualities in Medea. She's very skilled in using herbs and making oils and enchantments and things like that. And, she is an extremely wise and intelligent woman, which, of course, is not, that's not what the typical societal expectation is of a woman. Now, of course, if she's the granddaughter of Helios, there is the sense that she could be immortal. Okay, there is a deified aspect to her. But she decides to use her powers to aid Jason. Now, this is very important. We want to think about that. Okay, so what happens is when he sows the dragon's teeth, Medea tells him to throw a rock in the middle of the soldiers so that they all get confused and fight each other. And that's exactly what happens. They fight each other and kill each other off. In the other story, one or two of them survive, and they end up helping Cadmus found Thebes. But in this particular story, they all get killed. Okay. And then when it comes to the dragon, the third task that, she instead of him having to kill the dragon, he puts the dragon to sleep with narcotic herbs that is given to him, again, by Medea. She drugs it, basically, and then he's able to get the fleece. Okay. And now Apollonius Rhodius says Medea only helped Jason because Hera had convinced Aphrodite to force Medea to fall in love with Jason. Okay, so supposedly this is Aphrodite's motivation. And we'll talk a little bit later about why Hera, as we know, Hera has her hand in everything. And Aphrodite, of course, her love is actually her weapon in a lot of ways. This is the way that she, because we all know that, people, perfectly ordinary, sane, and intelligent people can behave very, very differently when love is involved, either to their betterment or their detriment, depending on the situation. Okay, so what happens is Jason gets the fleece, but of course King Aeetes really doesn't want him to leave with the fleece. So Jason agrees to marry Medea. They're going to run off together in the night. And so as they're leaving, she decides she needs to distract her father as they're fleeing, and she does so by killing her brother, Absyrtus. Okay. So here now she's committing murder. Okay, first she's just using her witchcraft. Now she's committing murder. Okay, so they say in some versions they dismembered the brother's body and scattered his parts on an island, knowing her father would stop to retrieve them for proper burial. In other versions, Absyrtus pursues them and then is killed by Jason. Okay, however, they say here in the Argonautica, Medea and Jason stopped on her aunt Circe's island so she could be cleansed after murdering her brother, which relieves her of blame for the deed. This is always the way. When there's a murder that is committed, one has to go to somebody who has the ability or the privilege. Usually it's a king. In this case, it's Circe, who is also who is also a witch herself and an immortal. She does absolve them of the deed, but it's said that she does not sanction what they're doing. So she does the cleansing, but it's kind of like, okay, you've been cleansed, but I don't approve of what you're doing. Get out of here, kind of thing. So, so we see Medea not only aiding Jason. Jason never actually does anything. A lot of times when we talk about these heroic epics, like when we talk about Heracles, for example, or we look at what Odysseus goes through in the Odyssey, you see that these are warriors who are very directly engaged in combating these forces that are often kind of sometimes bizarre and supernatural, which could tell us one of two things. I mean, it can have to do with the supernatural, the kinds of forces that are in nature that one has to deal with, as well as dealing with other human beings, right? But there's, certainly there is and you can interpret this also as having to deal with psychological force as well. And that is the tack that I'm looking at here. Because for me, Medea is the ultimate anima figure in a lot of ways. Like her aunt Circe. She has this kind of, she's very quintessential, maybe more than ultimate. So basically, we look at Jason, and when you read the critiques of the Argonautica, many scholars will say, this guy's not a hero. He's no hero at all. He's moody, he's depressed, and he makes everybody else do his fighting for him. But really, when we look at it, Jason, I mean, and actually I've kind of felt that way about this story for years, and then when I really thought about it, I was like, actually, Jason is, what he's doing is, rather than relying on his kind of what we think of as the normal, rational, masculine warrior instinct, he's relying very exclusively on his feminine side, on the intuited, on the chthonic, rather than on what we tend to think of as what a hero should do. Should go out there and bravely fight and face the enemy and so forth. He has he has basically a divine feminine doing it for him. Okay, and as we know, the divine feminine can do things that are helpful, and the things that she's doing are, again, not direct approaches. I've talked about this many times, in many podcasts, so I don't want to be overly repetitive for regular listeners, but she's got this, but there's the kind of direct approach that we see, and I always feel that was only kind of exemplified in the Ajax Odysseus conflict, because Ajax, of course, is he is somebody who goes out there direct man-to-man, he fights. Odysseus tends to be, he does that as well, but he tends to be very crafty about how he does things. He's a manipulator. And there's that, again, difference between Athena and Ares. Ares has to do with direct, the direct war machine, direct conflict, whereas Athena is more about strategizing, guerrilla warfare rather than direct hand-to-hand combat, And that if we think about the masculine and feminine in the sort of more Western ideas of masculine active and passive feminine, then we may also see that's a more passive approach. It's the one it's not the direct one. We don't kill the dragon. We let it put it to sleep for a while. We use the things of the earth rather than, him just having to go in directly unprotected and just armed and ready for battle. It's just like, no, we find these other ways to work around, to avoid the conflict, to step aside from it. So this is what, but it's Medea who's doing these things for him or telling him what to do. So in a way, we can almost interpret this as Jason is listening entirely to the anima. Now, whether he's listening to her out of a sense of love is another question, because we know Medea is in love with Jason. We don't necessarily know that Jason is in love with Medea, but he does know that she is the one that's helping him. So he, so she, so even through the thing, now in the other parts of his journey, he's aided by other people on his ship or other warriors. He rarely gets directly involved in the fighting. So Jason becomes a very interesting kind of a figure. Now, what happens towards the end of the story? Well, they take off, and they had, there's several other events that happen. What was it? Okay, so I'm gonna just read this little bit, this summary bit. It says, Jason, celebrating his return with the Golden Fleece, noted that his father Aeson was too aged and infirm to participate in the celebrations. Medea understood the impact and was able to invigorate him by withdrawing the blood from Aeson's body, infusing it with herbs, and then returning it to his veins. So she revitalizes, using the blood, she revitalizes that, okay? It says, the daughters of King Peleus saw this and so asked Medea to perform the same service on their father. However, okay, so this is where Hera's wrath comes in, because Hera hates Peleus, okay? So therefore, she figured that somewhere in this chain of events, Medea is going to kill Peleus, which is exactly what she does. She performs the same ritual, but then so she demonstrates her powers. She says she cuts up an old ram and puts the pieces in a stew. Once it's in, she added some herbs, and suddenly a young ram jumps out of the stew. So they think, oh, great, we can do this. So the girls end up cutting up their own father, putting him into the pot. And of course, he never came to life. And having killed him, then they had to flee to Corinth from there. Okay, so this was, so Jason, the ceremony is never performed. He never actually becomes king. So they go to Corinth. Now, while in Corinth, he's, they stayed together for 10 years. And then, but then at some point, the king decides that he's going to, Creon decides that he's going to have Jason, he offers his daughter Glauce to marry Jason. And there's different variants again, there's all myths to the conclusion. Generally what happens is that Medea is, Jason is going to marry Glauce, and then Medea, because she is a dangerous woman, is told to leave the city with the children by Jason. So she responds, as we see in the Euripides play, by, first she makes this beautiful robe as a wedding gift for Glauce. But as soon as she puts it on, her body is set on fire, and then when her father tries to put it out, he's also set on fire. So she kills Jason's new bride. Then she kills both of his children, and then she takes off in the chariot of the sun. Okay? And of course, depending on the different versions that one reads of this, some of them, like there's Seneca's version, and then there's Euripides' version of the Medea story, and some are more sympathetic and some are not. Like in Seneca's, because he's certainly more philosophical and he's writing in the Roman period, he tends to be more, the woman has to be tempered with reason kind of a thing, and that really isn't the point of the story. That's when we try to add ethics and morals to stories like this, because as I've pointed out before, stories like this they're kind of beyond good and evil, even though the results are, the consequences are bad. Now, what we can say here is that Jason initially relied very heavily on his anima, okay? But then he just took her for granted and then pushed her aside when she was no longer needed, when it didn't suit his purposes or suit his social climbing or suit his external status in the world. Even though she's killed a lot of people for him, he's invoked this very, very potent kind of feminine force. And, you don't just say, oh yeah, well, that was nice, thanks, now get lost, which is pretty much what he was doing. And pretty much what the king was doing as well. And she's supposed to go into exile, and she's just like, and I'm like, you've picked the wrong woman to put in exile, because she basically then destroys everything connected with his outer life. She destroys his potential for his new marriage, she destroys the children. In other words, she's now, instead of acting in the creative aspect, she's acting in the destructive one. And the anima, just like a lot of these feminine figures that can be both creative and destructive, Medea now demonstrates, both sides. And it really, this is my view, okay? You can disagree with me, but I feel like this is really all Jason's doing, because he relies heavily on the feminine, but in the end, he does not know how to manage the feminine. So it becomes a problem for him. Now it's become a fatal problem, So after she leaves Jason, this is when she ends up being married to Aegis. Okay, so she goes away to she goes away to Athens. She goes away to Athens and she marries Aegis. Okay, and now she has children by Aegis, but then he also has, his other son is Theseus. Okay, again, the same hero who defeated the Minotaur. And he had, but he was separated from his father when he was very young. Trying to remember what the exact story is here. Okay. Right. So he had, there was I guess his father had known that he'd had this son, and so he had left weapons for him under a rock. And, but only the person, only his son would be able to move the rock and take the weapons, which he's able to do. And then his mother tells him who his father is and that he should take the weapons back to him in Athens and be acknowledged. So it says Theseus goes to Athens, which he had, and he, so he had a choice of which way he was going to go, but he goes by land. And when he arrives, he doesn't say who he is. He's welcomed by Aegis, who's suspicious about him. And then Medea, of course, tries to have him killed by asking him to capture the Marathonian bull, but Theseus succeeds at this. And then she tries to poison him, but then Aegis recognizes his son and knocks the poison out of her cup out of his hand, and then Medea has to fly into exile once again. And in any case, it's said at that point that Medea may have fled to Asia or even to parts of Iran, and that her children, she had a son that was supposedly a son, Medes, and the Medes of this particular area, which interestingly we associate with the Zoroastrians, are said to be descendants of Medea. Okay, so so she's, so looking at Medea here, we see her as this, obviously a very dangerous feminine figure. I think of Jung's discussion of the anima, in which he says, that when the anima meets, when the man encounters the anima, that she injects her poison. He actually uses that phrase. And this, of course, it's very, very much connected with the way the erotic desire in which one falls in love, or at least falls in lust, or, with that image, what the man is overcome by the anima image, and may not behave in ways that are rational or normally within their, that are not typical to what we would think of as perhaps a reasoned or sensible response to things, as frequently does not happen in love. Sometimes you can get very enamored of people who maybe aren't any good for you, but you can't help yourself, right? So, and Medea, her power is intense. She's quite independent. And again, if you want to think about it in the social sense, she's not your typical society woman. Even though she is royalty, even though she's the granddaughter of the sun god, she's not, it's very clear that she's very inhuman in her attributes, which connects her, gives her an animaistic kind of quality. And she also has this connection to Hecate as well, which makes her chthonic. I mean, it's she's that dangerous power that is connected with the earth and with the wisdom of the earth. There was a discussion here from Emma Griffiths about the analysis of Medea's character, and so the way this is said here, and I'm actually taking this from Wikipedia, it says Medea does not fit into the mold of a normal woman according to Athenian philosophy. She's depicted as having great intelligence and skill, traits typically viewed as masculine by Euripides' original audience. On the other hand, she uses intelligence to manipulate the men around her, which is seen as a negative feminine trait. Okay, that manipulation. And remember what I said about Odysseus and about his connection to Athena. That manipulation, that strategy. Because women are said to have, feminine wiles, as they call them, right? So that she has that. And it says, says Griffiths here, Emma Griffiths, she acknowledges the paradox of the methods Medea uses to kill. She poisons the princess, which would have been seen as a feminine way of murder, yet kills her children in cold blood, which is seen as more masculine. Medea is also shown as a normal Athenian mother by having a dialogue about her children and showing a strong maternal love and connection to them. Yet at the end of the play, she's able to kill them as part of her revenge. Okay, so it creates, as she says, a complicated character who embodies both of these kinds of characteristics. But however, like I said, I feel like this gets into that aspect, in my opinion, of the divine feminine. We tend to think of the feminine as passive, and in some ways there is a passivity there, but this reminds me of more the Shakti kind of active feminine. Okay, it's the active feminine that's the thing that people seem to be actually afraid of, the feminine as that kind of power of consciousness. And it is a power that is uncanny. It's a power that has to do with nature. So it's not about, the gods in their heaven, per se, even though, again, she has this connection to the sun god. She is still this very chthonic figure. And she has the power to help and to create great things, but when she is jilted and mistreated, then that power can turn destructive. And yes, it can be in cold blood because she is, it's not, Griffith's kind of commentary here puts it, again, that very moral slant on it that I don't necessarily feel is there in ancient myth. I feel like it can be implied or added later. And yeah, the more people try to bring rationality into it, she becomes, in some ways, I don't know, almost a kind of cautionary tale. But Euripides does point out that she is complicated. She's not, you can't unilaterally say whether she's moral, immoral, good or bad, someone with feelings or without feelings. She embodies all of those contradictory qualities of the feminine. And that I think is frequently missed because, we tend to, in Western culture, have this idea of the feminine, or at least the ideal feminine, as being motherly, as being nurturing, as being, obedient or submissive in some way, or passive, or just fulfilling a certain role. And maybe in the negative sense, being manipulative and a little wily. But the woman who is intelligent and has knowledge of the earth, of the chthonic things, of the underworld, of the use of pharmaca, of herbs and potions and drugs and things, she's considered to be dangerous. And in these kinds of stories, this is the origin of where we get this idea of wise women or witchy women as somehow being a threat in some way, and the connection to the demonic is pretty obvious as well, because what is, the demonic is also a force that, you can, if you know how to work with the demonic, it can actually help you. If you don't know how to work with it, or if you, make an agreement and break it, or you do things, then, it can mean a lot of trouble for you. It can mean a lot of destruction. So, we see that connection there. Now, of course, demonic, as again, if I've said many times, I don't, to maybe re-explain for people who still think of demonic as sort of dealing with ultimate evil. And I mean, it's not saying that it's dealing with good, but it's at the same time, it has to do with this more chthonic energy. And that energy is potentially manipulative and deceptive, but if you know how to work with it, it can be helpful to you. And the only people who work with it are people who, tend to be in magical practice, who know how to build relationships with these kinds of entities. but but again, in the paradigm, in the more monotheistic paradigm where we say, oh, it's good versus evil, then they're evil and you should only strive, to deal with good, like angels and so forth, like we should only deal with good things. And I may remind people that angels and demons come out of the same stock. And Medea, in a way, is kind of an interesting example of that, because she clearly has her celestial connections, but her modalities are very chthonic. So, it's, so Medea is another really excellent example of that way in which, that complexity of the divine feminine, that because Jason initially uses the energy of the divine feminine to his benefit. When people ally themselves with it, they can prosper, good things can happen for them, or they can overcome certain challenges. But when they reject that, or they go against it, then it can become a problem. So, these stories of Medea represent the ways in which, men have difficulty negotiating the power of the feminine. And the feminine is very powerful. Perhaps, possibly, if not as powerful, perhaps even more powerful in some cases than the masculine. And that is still want to drive home that that's the piece that society tends to forget, or that society tends to, we still tend to want to see the feminine as sort of innocent or helpless or soft or passive. I mean, we have automatic, almost hardwired associations with that idea of the feminine. Certainly, it's built into our language and in everything else. And the reality here that needs to be broken, need to break through to, is the idea that it's not merely that. The feminine can be very warlike. It can be very active. It may not act in the same ways, but, is one way better than the other. In conflict, sometimes you need to approach things directly. Sometimes you need to take a more, manipulative or subversive kind of a route, because the direct approach won't work. So in any case, that's, I think, at the risk of me going into a long loop about stuff, that sums up, I think, the main things that we want to say about Medea. I want to thank you again very much for listening. If you are you can check out all of my work on chthoniya.net. You can, if you're not a subscriber to this podcast, you can subscribe any podcast service, whether it be on Google Play, iTunes, Spreaker is where it's hosted. You can do that. There'll be a video version available on YouTube. Maybe that's where you're watching this. And feel free to subscribe there. I'm also on social media as Chthonia Podcast. 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Instagram and Twitter. And if you're interested in supporting my work, please check out patreon.com/Chthonia, and hopefully see what's going on there. Certainly, that they get patrons get first notice of any new podcasts that have come out. But then there are also benefits, extra material and other things that I put out each month as well. So thanks again, and until the next episode.